Welcome back to Performance Process, the podcast where we break down the processes behind high-performance cycling. I'm Ronan. We've also got Caley here today.
Hello.
And we have a guest who is both a serial high performer himself on the Lifetime Gran Prix, out of the top 10 in this year's Unbound gravel, and at the forefront of optimizing gravel performance, Dylan Johnson. Dylan's known not just for his smart, evidence-based training strategies, but also for his meticulous approach to selecting the right equipment, optimizing for every possible watt saving, from tire width and pressure to drivetrain efficiency and aerodynamics. Today we'll dive into all that with Dylan, but before we do, we have a warning for our listeners, a geek warning.
Uh-oh.
The following episode may contain extreme geekery, which some listeners may find interesting, others may find offensive. This episode contains references to aerodynamics, rolling resistance, and drop bar mountain bikes, which some may find offensive. That said, we think it is appropriate for all of our listeners, and so it'll be on both the Performance Process and the Geek Warning channels for both our fastest and geekiest audience. You've been warned. Proceed with caution. And without further ado, Dylan Johnson, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That warning is good. I should probably put that warning in front of all the videos that I do. And I will say the drop bar mountain bike is offensive to a lot of people. It's very polarizing. Some people love it and some people hate it. So,
if there's a theme of 2024, it's even those who hate it are growing to love it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, as it's catching on more and more, I think more people come to like it, and especially if it starts winning races. That's the ultimate test, right? So it's hard to argue with a race win.
Don, before we jump into all that goodness that we just talked about, do you want to give, for those who maybe aren't aware of the Lifetime Grand Prix series or your own work on YouTube and your own podcast, give us an overview on who you are and what you do?
Sure, yeah. I'll try to make it as brief as I can. So I guess starting with what I do, I'm a cycling coach, I'm a YouTuber, and I'm also a professional bike racer. And though all three of those kind of feed each other. But the YouTube channel used to be very heavily focused on coaching topics, and I would say evidence-based coaching topics. So just as an example, I've done probably 5 videos on weightlifting and looked at the evidence on whether or not weightlifting makes you faster. Those sorts of videos. I would say more recently, I've been doing more tech-related videos, specifically around marginal gains, and I've been doing more race report videos, specifically around the Lifetime Grand Prix series, which I compete in. And so the Lifetime Grand Prix series is, I call it an off-road series. It's not exclusively gravel because there are mountain bike races in it, but it's a 7-race series here in the US and it's a selective series, meaning that only 30 men and 30 women get selected every year. And it's usually the fastest 60 riders in the US. And at this point, there's international riders coming in too. We're getting some riders from Australia, getting some riders from Europe, from South Africa. So it's an extremely competitive series because it's got pretty much the highest talent level for off-road racing in the US. And that's the series that I compete in. And I think that it actually makes for good content too, because some of the races, it's kind of challenging to determine what the right bike setup is going to be. It's not like going to a road race and it's like, well, clearly a road bike with the standard road gearing and standard road tires is going to be faster. Of course, that could probably be argued too, but I think the off-road nature of the series makes for a lot of head scratching about handlebars, about suspension, about tire width, about gearing. There's endless stuff to nerd out about, and my audience loves nerding out about stuff like that. So it's actually made for some good content recently.
Yeah, we definitely love nerding out in that sort of optimization thing here. I have in my notes that you're YouTube's preeminent authority on optimization this year. Is that? I don't think you've given enough credit there to some of the builds that you've Frankenbikes. Is that maybe how we would describe them for some of the races you've participated in this year?
To sort of back up what you're saying, Dylan, like one of the coolest things about the series for me is the fact that all these races sit in this sort of strange, like if you had a Venn diagram and one circle is gravel and one circle is sort of like cross-country Olympic mountain bike. Most of the races are kind of somewhere in the middle of that. And that's why you've started creating bikes that are kind of somewhere in the middle of that. And it makes a lot of sense when you sort of frame it in that way. But I think that one of the most interesting things about your take on both the series and on just the races that you're doing is this sort of willingness to chuck out tradition, and I think that's a big thing. It's a big part of what we want to talk about today is like how you go through that process and how you identify what bits of what has been done that make sense and what bits of what has been done that maybe don't. Right.
I think that first came to my attention. Obviously, I was aware of the channel for a few years already, done, but that sort of optimization work first came to my attention last year with the hardtail drop bar mountain bike that you had for Leadville. Then this year you had your Unbound bike, which for anybody who hasn't seen it, do you want to give us a brief overview of what your Unbound bike was this year? And then also give us a brief overview of the bike that you used for Leadville this year, because that was equally intriguing.
Yeah. We'll start with the Unbound one. So Unbound is an interesting puzzle because it is a pure gravel race. There's no single track in it. There's no quote mountain biking in it. It is a gravel race. I think over 90+% of the course is gravel, and then the rest of it is on pavement. But there's very little pavement, mostly gravel. But I think what makes it an interesting challenge as far as bike setup goes is that it is extremely rough on equipment. There's a ton of flat tires, ton of mechanical issues. If there's mud, that can be a huge issue too. And so I think but the big thing I would say is flat tires. There's so many punctures at Unbound. It's almost like half the field is going to get taken out with a puncture. Thinking about that, I had already had this idea that mountain bike tires might be better for Unbound, whether they're slower or faster, just because at least you could get to the finish line without having to stop and fix a puncture, which is huge. But I think 3 years ago, I started doing some testing myself with mountain bike tires versus gravel tires on gravel. And, what I'd do is I would pick a segment of gravel, preferably on a day that has as little wind as possible, because you don't want wind affecting it. And I would do repeated runs with, I'd usually have two of the exact same wheel sets set up with one tire setup and then set up with another tire setup. So I'd set it up with a gravel tire versus a mountain bike tire, and I'd just do repeated runs. And I try to get in a lot of runs, so I could get a good average for an average time for the mountain bike tire versus the gravel tire. And I've done this multiple times at this point, and I was shocked to find that most of the time a mountain bike tire was actually faster. And I'm not the only one to find this. Payson McKelvin has done this testing too, found the same thing, and Keegan Swenson, who's like the king of the Gran Prix series, has done testing and found the same thing, and also made the switch to mountain bike tires. And so this is super counterintuitive for people. The mountain bike tires don't feel faster. They don't seem like they should be faster, but when you actually test it, it is faster. And again, I want to emphasize that they don't feel faster. The second you put a mountain bike tire on your gravel bike and ride it, you're like, this thing feels slow.
Kind of reminds me of the old, we've talked about this a fair number of times, more on the road side of things, Ronan, the old sort of comparison to, like, if you drive down a dirt road and you put a Jeep on a dirt road or a Ferrari on a dirt road, and you drive both of them at 30 miles an hour, the Jeep feels slower than the Ferrari, right? So that I think our perception can be quite thrown by basically bumpiness, which is, I think, probably a similar thing that also happened in mountain bike for a long time, right? Like, how long did it take cross-country mountain bikes to drop 26-inch wheels and narrow little tires and all the rest. And we have this sort of strange human perception problem where we're actually not very good at determining what is faster. Like what feels faster is not actually what's faster.
Yeah. And I think the problem too is that the bumpier it feels, the faster it feels. Right. But it's not actually faster, it's just way bumpier. So I think there's actually I think there's a couple things going on with the mountain bike tires being faster. I think that the extra volume making the ride less bumpy, I think, is definitely part of it. But then I think there's also the fact that a lightweight cross-country mountain bike tire can get away with a thinner casing than the equivalent gravel tire. So most gravel tires do have a thicker casing than a lightweight cross-country mountain bike tire, and that's specifically because they have to deal with this puncture issue. Punctures are a huge issue in current gravel racing. And the way they get around that is they keep the same 40 to 45 millimeter tire, but they just increase the casing thickness. And as soon as you're increasing the thickness of the tire, the rolling resistance is increasing. So if you can have a thinner tire at a higher volume, and it's the higher volume that prevents you from getting the puncture. So if you can have a higher volume tire that's a thinner casing, the rolling resistance will actually be lower. So I think there's actually a couple reasons why a mountain bike tire ends up being faster than a gravel tire. And then I think that the biggest counter argument that people have is, okay, well, what about aero? A mountain bike tire is clearly less aero than a 40 millimeter gravel tire. And the speeds at Unbound are crazy. I mean, they're 22 mile per hour average speed. I don't know what that is in kilometers per hour, probably 35K an hour. Yeah, we're talking about road race speed, right? So aero matters. Aero matters a lot. And so this year, Silke and I went to the wind tunnel. We went to the wind tunnel the year before and found out some interesting things. But this year, we specifically wanted to get to the bottom of this aero tire wheel question. We wanted to find out two things. We wanted to find out whether or not deep wheels make any difference when you've got a wide tire. Because for a long time, people said, okay, you don't need deep wheels for gravel because the tire is already so much wider than the rim. And then we also wanted to find out how much of a penalty it was to run a wider tire. And even if the rolling resistance is better, is it actually worth running a narrower tire because the aero is so much better? And we found some interesting things. I would say the first thing that we found is that deep wheels actually do make a difference with wider tires. Probably not as much of a difference as if the tire was just slightly narrower than the rim, the rule of 105. But even with wide tires, the deep rim was making some sort of difference and was faster. And then I think the most shocking thing that we found, for gravel tires, we were using the Pirelli Cinturato H in everything from 35 to 50. So 35, 40, 45, 50. And as you would expect, as the tire got wider, it got slower, aerodynamically speaking. But then I also threw on a Continental Race King, which is a 2.2 mountain bike tire. And this was the most mind-blowing thing of the entire wind tunnel trip, is that when you paired the Continental Race King mountain bike tire with the deep rim, it ended up being just as aero as the 45 with the deep rim. And at that point, the decision couldn't have been more obvious for me. I was like, if there is no aero penalty to running this tire with this deep rim versus a 45, which is probably the narrowest I would go for Unbound anyway, I'm definitely running it.
We had a question, Caley, come up. Was it Zach who raised the question on the Geek Warning podcast a couple of weeks ago? Had you done a yaw sweep, or was that just at one fixed yaw that testing was at?
I think we did it straight on, and then we did it at 1.5. So it wasn't, the angle wasn't massive.
I want to go a bit deep on this because I'm fascinated by, I'm mostly a cross country racer. I don't do a lot of gravel stuff anymore, but we're talking about the same tires here. So, what are you finding you've done a fair amount of like just rolling testing, right, where you just go out and do repeats. What are your tires of choice at this point in that sort of like, it sounds like probably like a 2.2 kind of range is what you're generally going for. What have you been running?
Yeah, it's usually between a Conti Race King 2.2 and the Schwalbe Thunderbird 2.1. I don't have a tire sponsor, and I actually choose to not have a tire sponsor. Tire companies have come to me wanting to sponsor me, but I think tires are the most important equipment choice in gravel racing, and I don't want to compromise on that. So it's not it's not worth it to me to have a tire sponsor, and I like experimenting with different brands.
How do you determine? You mentioned two different tires there. How do you determine which one you'll use? What the course depend, or what's that look like?
Yeah, so with those two choices specifically, so the Conti Race King 2.2 versus the Thunderbird 2.1, I think the Thunderbird 2.1 does have a little bit lower rolling resistance just because it's got a thinner casing. I mean, it's probably the fastest mountain bike tire that you can buy, which also makes it the fastest gravel tire that you can buy, in my opinion. So, but the problem with it is the casing is so thin that you are risking flatting with that tire. So I would not run it for Unbound. I would not run it for Big Sugar. These are courses where flat tires are very common. But a course where flatting is less common, like Steamboat, I would probably use that tire.
That gets us into one of our listener questions, was like, do you have like a risk reward ratio that you can apply to? I think tires is probably the best scenario for this. Like, what sort of gain do you need to see, and what sort of risk do you need to risk?
Yeah, so I think that the mountain bike tires, the risk reward ratio is definitely a thing in gravel racing. And even with mountain bike tires, it's still a thing, because obviously I just said that there's this Thunderbird tire that I won't run if the risk of puncturing is too high. But I do think that running mountain bike tires is sort of the best of both worlds, because a mountain bike tire will reduce your risk of puncturing because the volume is so high, and it will be faster. There's almost no reason not to do it. Whereas, you know, there are certain choices where it is a risk reward thing. It's like, I could run this super thin casing tire and risk puncturing, or I could run the heavier tire and at least I'll make it to the finish line without puncturing. I think mountain bike tires for gravel specifically is there's not a trade-off. You will go faster and you will also not puncture. Knock on wood. Like, you can still puncture any tire if it's bad.
If you try hard enough.
your risk of puncturing with a mountain bike tire will be
Do you ever
lower.
run inserts?
So I used to run inserts back when I ran just standard gravel tires, because you could easily bottom out the tire on the rim with a standard 40 to 45 millimeter gravel tire. With a 2.2 mountain bike tire, I don't run inserts because it's rare to find a situation in a gravel race, even with running low pressure. Like in a 2.2, I'll probably run 17 to 20 PSI. Even with running that pressure, I'm rarely finding a situation where I can actually bottom out the tire on the
that's
rim.
probably more a necessity with mountain bike racing, really.
Sticking with ratios for a second, do you have like a pavement to gravel ratio that might influence this decision further?
Yeah, so I've done almost all of the testing I've done has been on gravel. So usually when I'm testing to tires, it's on gravel. And I will say that I haven't done enough testing on pavement to give a definitive answer about what tires are faster or slower on pavement. I'm willing to concede that probably a mountain bike tire would be slower on pavement, although, like I said, I haven't done enough testing on it. The races that I care a lot about don't have enough pavement to influence my decision. Like Unbound is almost it's well over 90% gravel. Big Sugar, well over 90% gravel. Most of the lifetime races, they're not these races that are split like 50-50 road gravel. And I know that there are a lot of gravel races like that do exist. But the lifetime Gran Prix races, the gravel races in the Gran Prix do not have a lot of pavement at all, which I kind of prefer. And also it sort of, I guess, makes the tire question easier, because then you don't have to think quite as much about pavement. And if I did, I probably would do more testing on pavement.
I want to return to something you said about pressure, because one of the difficulties with a higher volume tire, I've found, is that the sort of pressure sweet spot is actually harder to find. Maybe that's, if you extend that all the way out to like a road tire, there's usually like a 5 or 10 psi window where it feels pretty good and rides pretty well and all the rest. And I found, at least on mountain bike tires, and I'm running like generally sort of a 2.4, pretty similar to a Race King, actually, like the Maxxis version, which is like a Recon Race, very, very, very similar in tread pattern, similar in volume, a little higher volume. The window for where those tires feel good is like half a psi. So it's just like just vanishingly small, right? And how have you sort of sorted out where you're running pressure? Is it a feel thing morning of, like, okay, I know how chunky the course is going to be, I'm going to put a little bit extra in, or have you tested 17.5 with my Race Kings and I'm good to go?
So the optimal pressure will depend on how bumpy the course is or how chunky the gravel is. So it's not a case of, okay, well, I tested 17 PSI and it was faster, so I'll run 17 PSI everywhere, because, you could have tested on smooth gravel and now you're going to do a chunky gravel, or vice versa. So I use the Silca tire pressure calculator, and this is what I will say. I have done testing where I've started off with Silca's recommended pressure, and then I've gone up in pressure and I've gone down in pressure. And I will say they are shockingly close to the right pressure. And I've done this on multiple occasions. That recommendation that they give you is very close to the fastest pressure, because there is a pressure at which it's too low and your times start getting slower, and there's a pressure at which it's too high and your times start getting slower. And you're talking about feel. I think that's more of a mountain bike concern. Like, does the tire feel good? Does it have good grip? Is the handling good? I will say that for mountain bikers, that's probably more important. But on gravel, I mean, to be honest, I don't really care how it feels. The only thing I care about is what is the fastest pressure.
Few more corners in a cross country race than there are Unbound, for example. Yeah.
Hey folks, Ronan here, just briefly interrupting this episode to remind you that Performance Process is an Escape Collective members podcast. That means, it means our members have signed up to Escape Collective, they've supported Performance Process, and in doing so, I can dedicate time at work here to producing the podcast. It literally would not exist if it wasn't for our members. If you're not a member, don't worry, you can still listen to part of the episode. We cut it off around about halfway through, and this is just a brief reminder that you are listening to the version that gets cut off, again, around about halfway through. If you're already a member, head over to the members feed to get the full uninterrupted version. If you're not, head over to escapecollective.com/member to sign up now and, to no longer get interrupted like this and enjoy the entire podcast. When we're talking about mountain bike tires, and that, it seems to me, and Don, you've said a few times that they're outright fastest from the testing you've done, but it seems to me we've gone from most people racing with 40mm tires to literally overnight, and this may well be your fault, or you're maybe taking credit for it, but almost overnight going to what are effectively like 60mm tires. Do you think is that the true optimal? Are mountain bike tires that we have now the true fastest solution? Or do you think in future, actually, when the brands catch up with the work that you've done, we revert back to somewhere like 50mm with an actual race-focused gravel tire?
Yeah, it's hard to say.
I'm asking you to comment on something that you can't test because it doesn't exist. But
right, exactly. I mean, so there's got to be a point of diminishing return, right? I'm assuming this. I don't know, but I would assume that a fat bike tire is not faster, right?
Having ridden a fat bike,
what is
definitely not.
So what is the point at which the tire is too wide is the question, I guess. And to be honest, I don't know. I mean, I think if you posed this question even 2 years ago, no one would have thought that a mountain bike tire is faster. They're like, oh, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe like a 47 or something. Somebody who's very progressive with their tire width maybe would have been like 50. But thinking about 2.2 mountain bike tires, nobody was thinking about that. So I don't know if we need to go 2.4. I mean, most gravel bikes don't fit that. Like, I just don't know where the point of diminishing return lies.
Yeah, I mean, like mountain bike all went 2.4, right? Everybody's on 2.4s. In fact, some of the specialized guys are running 2.6s at various points in the World Cup season this year. So it wouldn't surprise me if it goes that way, but you're right. The bikes have to fit it first. That's actually a big part of the problem is that this has happened so fast. We were talking about this on Geek Warning last week, or 2 weeks ago. Like half the brands, and you mentioned it in an Instagram post. That's actually what brought up the topic on our pod. You were like, anybody who's got a race bike that doesn't fit a tire like this is not really a race bike right now. And I think that the brands are probably scrambling to figure out what exactly that looks like and how they build for it. And because there's probably some other optimization that can happen too, right? If you're building a bike around a tire that size, and also a bike that's going to be traveling at 22 miles an hour for the duration of Unbound, can you build an aero frame that works with a 2.2 or a 2.4? Like, there's probably some other interesting things that kind of come off the back of that, right? Yeah,
certainly. I think that I don't want to call out a brand specifically, but I kind of am going to call out a brand specifically. It was just very funny that the weekend of Steamboat was the weekend that Trek launched their new Checkmate bike, which has a claimed max tire clearance of 45, I believe. And the race was won by Keegan Swenson on 2.2 mountain bike tires. And it's just, obviously when they were designing that bike, they were probably designing it, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago. And they could have never foreseen this happening. But it's just like the bike comes out and it's already behind the times.
Have you played with 650B at all? Because so my wife, relatively short, she's like 5'3" or something like that. So her little bike, her little gravel bike, I set it up with 650 by 50s like years ago, probably 6-7 years ago now. And she always loved them. She'd ride them on the road. She said they were plenty fast. They never, she never hindered her keeping up with us. And I feel like that 650B had a moment, right? And it's very much passed kind of in the same way that it passed pretty quickly in mountain bikes. But have you played around with that at all? Because it does make more room in like if I'm sitting here with a gravel bike I bought a year ago that I don't want to replace yet, it does make a bit more room if you stick a 650 in there.
Yeah. I ran 650s. So last year I was on Factor, and Factor's Ostro Gravel has a max tire clearance of 45. And I just really wanted a wider tire for Big Sugar. So I actually threw a pair of 650s on and ran 50 millimeter tires on those for Big Sugar. And I didn't run, the only reason I ran the 650s is because I wanted more tire clearance. The felt gravel bike that I have now, I can run 700s with a 2.2 Conti Race King. So I don't really have a reason to go to 650s, except for Unbound this year, I was worried that it was going to be muddy because there was the potential for mud. It ended up being dry on race day, but there was the potential for mud. And I actually called up my wheel sponsor, Reynolds, very last minute and said, can you send me a pair of 650 gravel wheels? Because I want them just so I've got extra clearance in my frame, because the mud at Unbound is very sticky. It clogs your frame. And I was like, if I've got a smaller wheel, then I've got a little bit more clearance. As far as would I ever consider going to 650 for racing if clearance isn't an issue? Probably not. I'll probably stick with 700 for honestly, just for the same reasons that mountain biking went with 29er over 27.5.
You mentioned some of the testing you've done. Have you any plans for more tire testing this off season? And specifically, I'm wondering because as you mentioned, Unbound is 90+% gravel, but there will be other races you're doing and others are doing that actually sections of the course are paved or have other unique characteristics to them. And I'm kind of wondering, at what point do you the question in a lot of people's minds will be, in gravel, should you optimize, or off-road even, because there's obviously mountain bike races in the Lifetime Gran Prix also, in off-road, should you optimize for the entire event, or should you optimize for the place where you're most likely to win or get dropped? And I think Brennan Wirtz is a good example from Gravel Nationals last week, where he had optimized for the final 2 kilometers. That was where he had planned to make an attack. And he had ran tires that probably were suboptimal for the rest of the race, but probably helped him win when he made that move with 2K to go. So yeah, I'm kind of wondering, having seen Brennan do that, have you any plans to like broaden out the testing to better equip yourself to answer those questions next year?
Yeah, I think I do need to broaden the testing. I always plan on doing more testing. And I think testing on pavement would be important, especially considering how crazy and how extreme the tire sizes have gotten. So I think testing on pavement would be important. You bring up a great example of Brendan Wirtz having, probably the right tire. It's funny. I think he was on 44s, which just 2 years ago would seem super wide, right? But
yeah, good point.
But compared to the rest of the field, those were narrow tires. And also, I think in the photo of him winning the race, he's just such a big guy that by comparison, the tires look like they're road tires. But yeah, actually at Gravel Nationals, Keegan Swenson and Tobin ran a 2.4 mountain bike tire on the front. And I think it was just because it's such a sandy course and they wanted to be able to get through those sand sections better. But you bring up an excellent point. Is a 2.4 good for that final 2K of paved road where you could get anything from first place or you could get 10th place. You could get, I mean, that is kind of the race deciding section of that course. If you don't get away solo before that. So I think that it really depends on the race, whether you optimize for the entire course or whether you optimize for a certain decisive section. I have this conversation a lot about Paris-Roubaix, actually. I think that one of my, and I've never done Paris-Roubaix. I've never even ridden on those kinds of cobbles.
Yeah,
so I'm probably I probably shouldn't be speaking on this, but I just think that the bikes that they currently ride for Roubaix are suboptimal. And I think there's a number of reasons why they're suboptimal, but I do think that the tire size is too small right now. And considering that Roubaix is kind of like Unbound in the fact that it's sort of an equipment lottery. Like, are you going to get a puncture? Are you going to have a bike mechanical? I think that right there is an argument to run wider tires, even if they're not faster or slower. Even if it was neutral, I think it'd be an argument to run wider tires just so you have less of a chance of getting a puncture. And then I think that if you could get it set up to where it's neutral or at the very least a small penalty on the pavement sections, I think wider tires would be a massive savings on the cobbled sections, because cobbles are bumpier than most gravel, and I'm finding that mountain bike tires are actually faster on gravel.
Yeah, Roubaix is a perfect example. I think we talk about it every year, Caley. It's like they're moving to more and more standard equipment because the race is getting faster and faster and faster. But surely still there has to be some gains left on the table by not looking at things like wider tires that you mentioned or suspension for a course which includes like 50 kilometers of cobbles like that. And that kind of gets me back to your Unbound bike, because not only did you have wide tires and 60 mil deep rims, which we'll also talk about, but you had suspension there also. So let's get back to that bike and chat about.
Can I make a prediction in public first? I would like to predict that we're going to see 40s on Roubaix bikes within the next 2 years, maybe even this spring. Which will be
hilarious, because then a World Tour road event will have wider tires than a cyclocross event.
I can almost guarantee it.
I am 100% in agreement, and the day that happens, I will clip every single podcast that I've said that on, and just gloat about how right I was 5 years previous.
Well, make sure you clip the clipping from this podcast as the first one.
It's got to happen, right? It's absolutely got to happen. I think that once the bikes catch up, and it'll be like a Mate Mohoric or somebody who does that first, right? Who's like willing, he's the Dylan Johnson of the World Tour. Like he'll make it happen. Anyway, back to Unbound bikes.
We're pretty sure both Mate and Casper Asgreen listen to this podcast.
They do.
So we if they turn up next year with those bikes, we can pin it all back to this moment.
I have to say, Mohoric winning Milan San Remo with the dropper post, because road is so traditional, and I can't imagine a lot of roadies ever considering using a dropper post ever. huge props to him. That made me an instant fan. And I've said this, most of the time bike races are won by the strongest rider. Occasionally bike races are won by the smartest rider. And that was a day that the bike race was won by the smartest rider or the most skilled rider, because he was extremely skilled on that descent too. But I think even he would admit he wasn't the strongest rider in the race. He was the smartest and most skilled.
Let's get to the Unbound bike. So yeah, suspension. Talk to me about the decision to go suspension.
Yeah, so that I would call it. The suspension that I ran for Unbound was a Lauf fork, and it's a leaf spring fork. I would and I've ridden actual suspension forks for gravel. I've been riding the Cane Creek inverted fork, and I have also ridden the Fox gravel fork. And in my opinion, the Lauf is kind of a halfway point between rigid and suspension. At least that's what it feels like. They claim that it's got 30 mil of travel. I don't know. It's debatable. But it sort of feels like a halfway point. It doesn't quite feel like an actual suspension fork, but it gives a little bit more, obviously, than a fully rigid fork. And I do think that helped with the bumpiness of the course. But honestly, the main reason that I ran it is because I had the crazy idea to throw that on the bike in the wind tunnel when we were, this is the same trip that we tested the tires and the wheel setups. We also tested some stuff on the bike. And I was like, let's throw this fork on and see what happens. And again, this also blew our mind. Somehow that fork was more aero than the standard felt fork, which that felt fork was probably not designed for aero, but it did shock a lot of us.
There was no leaf springs on it though. That certainly doesn't pass like the eye test, which is aerodynamics is so funny that way, isn't it?
Yeah. It doesn't look aero. None of us expected it, but that is not the first time that we've found something completely unexpected in the wind tunnel. Last year, I think the most surprising finding was that running a USWE hydration pack, at least on my body, probably not on everyone's body, but at least on my body, adding the pack made me more aero than not having the pack on. At least I found that surprising. Some people thought it was obvious, but whatever.
I mean, it is surprising because everything we've heard for the past 2 years has been you put the pack down the front of your suit and it's more aero there. But hearing it works for you on your back is definitely surprising.
Yeah, and actually, we did test a bottle down the front of my jersey, and that was probably the biggest savings of the entire day. So I have been doing that at some gravel races too lately.
So is the Lauf fork, and Caley, I've put you on one of those. We built a bike for Paris-Roubaix a few years ago, and it was a Trek Domani with the Lauf fork on it also. I haven't ridden one myself because I happened to have a broken leg at the time, but I must dig that up and get it going. It's just to get a feel for myself what that's like. But is that now your go-to fork for every event that you're riding similar bike?
Yeah, like I said, I've played around with the Cane Creek inverted suspension fork and the Fox fork. I could see some races where I would actually choose one of those two options, either the Cane Creek or the Fox, if it was extremely bumpy and it was more of a mountain bike style gravel race. But I would say for most gravel races, I've been going with the Lauf fork.
If you do take the Lauf fork back to the wind tunnel this winter, I want to know what happens if you add. There's a thing called gap tape, and it's effectively tape that just has like only one half of it is sticky, and I reckon you could fill in the gap between the fork legs and the leaf spring. Maybe it could be even faster, or who knows, could be slower. The rims. You went for 60 mil rims, is that right?
Yeah, 60 mil rims, and these aren't particularly wide internal width rims either. These are just the Reynolds Black Label road wheels, 21 millimeter internal rim width. Although I will say they bow out quite wide, so the widest point externally is 36, which could have assisted with the aero. And the reason I went with those is because we tested them, and even with the wider tires, they were faster. So I went with those and the Conti Race King 2.2 tires on those.
Any temptation to try even deeper rims?
Yeah, well, my wheel sponsor Reynolds, that's the deepest they go. So I would love to try deeper though. Yeah.
Try spoken a disc maybe.
So I don't know if you guys know who Chase Work is. Chase Work is also in the Lifetime Grand Prix, and his bike setup for Unbound was pretty interesting too. I would almost say it was more geeky than my bike, if that's possible. But he ran a disc rear wheel for Unbound.
Mm-hmm. Was it a disc or was it that head that is effectively a disc, but technically speaking,
it's got a hole in the middle of it,
got like a tiny hole.
Yeah. So for Unbound, I think he ran the head 180. But for the recent races that we've been doing, like Nationals and I think the Gravel Worlds race in Nebraska, he ran a full disc. No hole in the
There's
middle.
a guy who raced cyclocross in New England 20, 30 years ago named Paul Curley, who used to rock the old, I think they were Tiogas or something like that. They were the old, like, you could see the strings inside the Yeti guys used to run them sometimes way back in the day. I think it's awesome. I think disc wheel in cross country or gravel racing is just like, why not? I mean, the wind is not really necessarily an issue, crosswinds and control and things like that, and I don't think it would be meaningfully less comfortable or anything like that.
Yeah. Talking to Chase, I've actually never ridden a disc wheel in my life because
you're missing out, man. You're missing out.
I know. I agree. I don't come from a TT background, so I didn't have experience with a disc wheel. But Chase was like, I can tell that everybody asks me about if I get blown around in crosswinds, and I can just tell that no one's ridden a rear disc before. Because his claim, at least, is that it doesn't blow him around at all if it's at least if it's a rear disc. It can be pretty windy and he's fine.
I think that's in general true.
The steering doesn't come from the back of a bike. Yeah, it's I don't know why triathlon banned discs on 1D days, but it's up front you need to be concerned about. And I'm kind of like you've said earlier, you don't really care how it feels. Presumably in previous years you've used shallower wheels. This year you're using 60mm rims. Is there any loss there when it comes to handling, cornering, general feel? Like, it's probably immeasurable, but in terms of, like, is it possible you get to the finish line slightly more fatigued from a rougher ride or anything? Have you looked into any of those sorts of things?
So I think that any rougher ride is completely counteracted by the fact that I had such wide tires. So in previous years, I did run shallower rims, but I was also running 42s. So 42s with a shallower rim is less comfortable than 60s with 2.2 mountain bike tires. The tire does most of the work. So this year's Unbound bike was far more comfortable than any bike I've ever ridden for Unbound. I think my first Unbound ever, I had 38s, if you can believe it or not, but that was back in 2018. And that was probably the least comfortable Unbound I've ever had.
Wow. And in terms of handling of that, anything, I mean, yeah, so much of Unbound is straight roads anyway, but was that a concern at all?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think that the handling, any handling detriment is counteracted by the fact that a mountain bike tire handles so much better than a gravel tire on gravel. The cornering is so much better. The traction is so much better that, I mean, if I were to run these wheels with a standard 42 gravel tire, maybe I would notice detriments in both comfort and handling, but the fact that the tire is so much wider than what I've ever run in the past, no.
When you're riding on loose surfaces, and by loose surface, I mean generally like sort of rocks, pebbles, gravel kind of stuff versus like loose mud or something like that, it's all about the volume. It's not about the knobs, right? So that's where your traction is coming from. Like around here, we ride that sort of loose over hard pack kind of stuff all the time, and there's not really any point in running like a big trail tire. You'd have marginally more grip than you'd have on a Maxxis Aspen or something like that. So yeah, it makes perfect sense that you're basically relying on that volume to grab you as you're getting around corners. And there's not that many corners in something like Unbound. Like, let's be honest. Like there's not none, but there's not that many. It's not like you're gonna make or break yourself in cornering.
Yeah, there's a 90-degree corner every 5 miles. You know?
Yeah.
So
it's like 10-mile time trial. Anything else about the Unbound bike before we head over to Leadville? You had 35 mil bars, if I remember right. Was there anything else you did there that just annoyed everybody?
37 at the hoods, and it's the Envy Aero bar. 37 at the hoods, and I think 40 at the drops. Maybe. We actually tested the Aero Coach bar. I forget what the model name of that
Onyx?
is, but the Onyx, which is 32 at the hoods. And to be fair, I wasn't used to riding that bar and wasn't used to getting in a very narrow position with that bar, but I think that bar actually ended up slower for me. And Josh Portner pointed this out. When I was on that bar, my elbows were actually out wider than when I had the wider bar, which could probably be fixed by just me being conscious of that. But then again, when you're racing for 10 hours, it's hard to be conscious of things like that. So I ended up going with the 37 width at the hoods. And as far as gearing goes, I did a 52 tooth chain ring, 36 tooth small ring, and then 11 to 34 cassette. And the reason for going that's a bigger chain ring than most people will run for gravel, but it's the same reason people are running big chain rings for road. I was just trying to optimize efficiency there.
Would you change anything?
I would. So what I would like to see from a gravel bike is for a gravel bike to essentially become an aero road bike that can fit mountain bike tires. I want a aero road bike that can fit mountain bike tires. And I will say that probably some optimization needs to be done there, because I'm sure that if you're on mountain bike tires, then perhaps the down tube needs to be wider and some things need to be changed. But I think there are some companies making some sort of aero claims for their gravel bikes or doing some aero tube shapes, but it's not enough in my opinion. I want to see all out aero geekery in gravel like we currently do in road.
You want to get away from aero aesthetics and go all out to aero.
I wonder what that looks like. Yeah. I
think it looks like the 3T.
Yeah, I think 3T is a bit ahead of its time.
That's
right
a good
now.
point. That's a good point.
Like you mentioned fit there a little bit with the Aero Coach bars and the MV bars and just how your elbows popped out. Like looking at you on a bike, also you seem like you've been constrained somewhat by current geometries. Is that something you'd like to see change also? Maybe longer front ends, or you've got that slam forward saddle position. Are you in an optimal setup there, or are you making do?
Well, I usually, it depends on the frame, but I'm usually slamming my saddle forward on almost every bike I've ever had. And I also run a fairly long stem by gravel standards, 140 millimeter stem.
It's long by road standards also.
It's just a long stem in general. So yeah, a longer front end would mean that I could probably get away with a shorter stem, which I would be into. As far as geometry changes, I think that the bike feels okay and it fits really well. I'm very used to that position right now. I don't necessarily have issues with that position, I would say.
Okay, folks, that's where we're cutting off the free version of this podcast this week. Just a reminder, if you head over to escapecollective.com/member, you can sign up now and you can get the entire podcast uninterrupted. You'll not have me butting in to cut you off or to remind you that you're not yet a member. And in doing so, you will be helping to ensure this podcast continues for many more episodes and months and years to come. So head over escapecollective.com/member now to sign up to Escape Collective and to get the entire episode of Performance Process, along with all of the other podcasts and written content that we publish on our website.